Okay, let's get started on document B. All right, now first of all, we take a look at everything we can see on the document. Remember, we see a source. Draw an arrow at the source. Source is Lucius Flavius Arrianus, and the name of his book is The Campaigns of Alexander, and it was written around, circa means around. We'll draw a circle around the circle. Circa means around 130 CE. Remember, CE means Common Era. And when does the Common Era begin? It begins at the time of Christ. Here's a note about Lucius, and the note says, Lucius Flavius Arrianus, known as Arrian, was a Greek philosopher and historian who lived some 400 years after the time of Alexander. His book is considered the best account of Alexander's reign. In this excerpt, Arrian describes Alexander's last major battle, fought against a prince named Porus on the eastern bank of the Hydaspes River in India. Because he was so impressed with Porus's bravery, Alexander allowed him, who's him? Him is Porus. Allowed Porus to retain administrative rule after the Indians' defeat. Okay, and then we have the main part of the document. So let's read through it together. Alexander pitched camp on the bank of the Hydaspes, and Porus was to be seen on the other bank with his whole army and his force of elephants. He realized that he could not cross at the point where Porus was encamped. His elephants were too numerous. So, who is this he? This he is Alexander. Alexander realized that he could not cross at the point where Porus was encamped. Who's his for his elephants? His elephants are Porus's. So put a little P there. Porus's elephants were too numerous. When Alexander saw this, he decided to move his troops in all different directions so that Porus would keep puzzled. At night, he would take most of his cavalry to various points along the riverbank where he would create a clamor, raise the war cry, and produce all other such noises as would come from men preparing to cross the river. Porus would actually parallel his movements on the other side, leading his elephants toward the shouting, and Alexander got him into the habit of making these corresponding movements. This actually went on for quite a long time, until Porus no longer reacted. Now there's an editor's note right here. Let's read that. It comes in between these two paragraphs. Editor's note. Arrian then writes that Alexander, leaving 5,000 armed men in full view opposite Porus's camp, led a force exceeding 10,000 foot soldiers, archers, and cavalry, and crossed the river about 10 miles upstream. Now remember, the movie said 17 miles. So this guy's was written, remember, this was written at 130 CE. The movie was put together by researchers many years later, modern researchers. So I'll be willing to bet that it's, well, anywhere from 10 to 15. Rafts for ferrying the men were made from hides wrapped around hay and sewn watertight. The crossing was further hidden by a midnight thunderstorm. Too late to stop the crossing, Porus arranged his army on a nearby plain and prepared for battle. The narrative continues. Now the story continues. The engagement was unlike any other previous battles. Porus's elephants were now boxed in, and the damage inflicted by them fell on friend no less than foe, with men trampled under as the beasts twisted and turned. Most of the drivers of the elephants, too, had been brought down by spears. Eventually, the animals grew tired and their charges lost vigor, energy. That means the animals' charges lost energy. They were wore out. The elephants were wore out. Alexander then threw his cavalry in a circle around the entire force and ordered the infantry to lock shields, to group tightly, and to advance as a phalanx. At this juncture, the Indians all took to flight. And that means they ran away. They were done. Okay? Now, take a look at that. And the only two questions I want you to be concerned about down here is questions 4 and 5. How can you use this document to argue that Alexander was great? Does anything in this document show courage, intelligence, or leadership? Okay, and you want to put that over here in your graphic organizer that we were working on. So wherever you finish document A at, let's see you finish document A down here. Okay, put document B, and then put the evidence for greatness over here, and the evidence for not so greatness over there. Okay, so work on that for a few minutes. Alright, now let's take a look at document C. Again, we start with every line. Here's our source, this guy named Peter Green, who wrote a book called Alexander of Macedon, and it was printed by the University of California in 1991. So this is a modern book. There's a note, and the note says, during Alexander's march down the Mediterranean coast, many cities surrendered without a fight. Now, let's back up. This document should have come first, because this document, this story happens long before Alexander's fight with Porus. So keep that in mind. During Alexander's march down the Mediterranean coast, many cities surrendered without a fight. Some cities were happy to have the Persians removed. Alexander treated these cities rather kindly. Now, which cities did he treat kindly? Alexander treated these cities rather kindly. Okay? The cities that surrendered. All right? Tyre was another matter. Its citizens, whose citizens? Tyre's. Tyre's citizens refused to surrender. They believed their city was unconquerable because it was built on an island and protected by high walls. Alexander proceeded to build a causeway or land bridge of timber and rubble so his soldiers could cross from the mainland to the island. The city held out for 7 months, and Tyrian counterattacks caused Alexander to lose many men. In the end, however, the causeway was completed and Alexander's army smashed into the city. And this is what happened. When the last organized resistance was broken, Alexander's soldiers ranged through the city on a ferocious manhunt. Alexander had ordered that all, and this means all people except those who sought sanctuary or safety in the temple, were to be slain. That means everybody who didn't run to the temple for safety was killed. And his commands, what commands? To kill everybody. His commands were executed with savage relish. And that means, over here, they enjoyed it. They enjoyed killing. The air grew thick with smoke from burning buildings. 7,000 Tyrians died, and the number would have been far higher had it not been for the men of Sidon, who entered the city alongside Alexander's troops. Even though Tyre had been Sidon's rival for centuries, these neighbors of the victims, horrified by what they now witnessed, managed to smuggle some 15,000 of them to safety. The great city was now utterly destroyed. Her king, Azimelech, and various other notables, including envoys from Carthage, had taken refuge in the temple of Melkart, and Alexander spared their lives. The remaining survivors, some 30,000 in number. So how many survivors were there? There was 30,000 survivors. The remaining survivors, some 30,000 in number, he sold into slavery. 2,000 men of military age were crucified. Okay, that means they were hung up on a cross to die, just like Christ. 2,000 men of military age were crucified. All right. Now, I would want you to focus on question 3. What do you learn about Alexander from his decision to crucify 2,000 men? 4. Is there any good military reason for the severe treatment of the Tyrian survivors? Think about that. You don't have to write those answers in, but think about what you learn about Alexander from these 2 facts. And then look at 5 and 6. How does this document help you argue that Alexander was great? And how does this document help you argue that Alexander was not great? Okay, and then you will take and you will put that on your paper. Let's say this is where you end the document. And if you need a new sheet of paper at this time, then just go ahead and get one. Just make sure you put great on the left and not so great on the right. Okay, and so then put your evidence for greatness and not greatness from document C right there. Okay, pause it. All right, now let's do document D. All right, again, we start with the source. Again, is Lucius Flavius Arrianus, in the same book that we read before, Campaigns of Alexander, around 130 CE. Here's a note. Ancient biographers of Alexander told these stories. They are retold here by Arrian and a modern-day historian. True or not in their detail, the stories reveal 2 sides of Alexander that were probably accurate. Remember, these are legends, so they've got to be based in fact, but then the exaggerations are maybe not so believable. Okay? So let's take a look at this legend. Here's the way the story goes. The army was crossing a desert of sand. The sun was already blazing down upon them, but they were struggling on under the necessity of reaching water, which was still far away. Alexander, like everyone else, was tormented by thirst, but he was nonetheless marching on foot at the head of his men. That means he was walking just like everybody else. Let's underline that. He was nonetheless marching on foot at the head of his men. That means he was out front walking. It was all that he could do to keep going, but he did so. And the result of what? The result of him keeping going. The result, as always, was that the men were better able to endure their misery when they saw that it was equally shared. So they saw that Alexander was equally willing to suffer with them. He didn't ride his horse or anything. He walked with them, and that made it easier for them to see their leader setting that kind of an example. As they toiled on, a party of light infantry, which had gone off looking for water, found some. Just a wretched little trickle collected in a shallow gully. They scooped up with difficulty what they could and hurried back to Alexander. Then, just before they reached him, they tipped the water into a helmet and gave it to him. So here's his men giving Alexander just a sip of water that they found. Alexander, with a word of thanks for the gift, took the helmet and, in full view of his troops, poured the water on the ground. He wouldn't drink it. So extraordinary was the effect of this action that the water wasted by Alexander was as good as a drink for every man in the army. Okay? So his pouring that water out, he didn't want to drink that water because his soldiers couldn't drink any water, so he wasn't going to drink any, and that motivated them just as much as if they had had a drink for everybody. Okay, now you have to try to decide where the facts are and where the legend is. Okay, now let's take a look at the legend of the hat band. Alexander was himself steering the trireme, which is a warship with oars. So now they're on some kind of a warship somewhere. When a strong gust of wind fell on his broad-brimmed Macedonian hat and the band that encircled it, the hat, being rather heavy, fell into the water. However, the band was carried along by the wind and was caught by one of the reeds growing near the tomb of one of the ancient kings. One of the sailors swam off toward the band and snatched it from the reed. but he did not carry it in his hands because it would get wet while he was swimming. He therefore put it around his own head. Now that band is just like the crown. Whoever wears that band is like wearing the crown. And this soldier put the crown, put that band on his head and brought it to the king. Most of the biographers of Alexander say that the king gave him a talent as a reward for his zeal. And a talent down here means more than $10,000. After he gave him that, then he ordered his head to be cut off, because the prophets had explained that he should not allow the head that had worn the royal headband to be safe. So the prophets told him that anybody who ever wears the royal headband besides you, cut their head off. Cut their head off. Okay? So, let's take a look at our questions. All right. In the first story, why did Alexander pour the water on the ground? In the second story, why did Alexander give the soldiers who saved the hatband a reward, and why did he then order the man's head cut off? Now, these are the two questions that you want to focus on. How do you use these legends to argue that Alexander was great, and how do you use them to argue that he was not great? Now, remember, even though they're legends, look at what it says in the note. The stories revealed two sides of Alexander that were probably accurate. Okay? So Alexander was probably, if he didn't actually do this right here, he was the kind of man who would have done that. That's what they're saying. And if he didn't actually do this, he was the kind of man who would have done this. Okay, so pause it there. Don't pause it. Use your thing here. If you have to, go to the back and put great here and not so great here. Doc D, and put your evidence in there. Okay, go ahead and do that now. All right. And that is it. That's all we got. We don't have to do document E. I changed my mind. Alrighty, now all you have to do is write the essay.